King Charles has finally spoken, and his words may be the clearest signal yet of how serious this moment really is. On the morning of February 19th, as police confirmed the arrest of his brother, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the king released a carefully worded statement. He didn't defend. He didn't accuse. Instead, he emphasized something else entirely, that the law must take its course. But what makes this moment so unusual isn't just the arrest itself, it's what it represents. A situation unfolding inside one of the world's most closely watched families, under public scrutiny, legal procedure, and historical weight. So how did it reach this point? And why is the king's response being seen as one of the most revealing royal statements in recent memory? To understand that, you have to go back to the morning. Everything changed. It began quietly. There were no official announcements at first, no press conferences, no dramatic scenes, just images, police officers present at Wood Farm, a residence on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, where Andrew had reportedly been living. At first, the meaning of those images wasn't immediately clear, but soon after, authorities confirmed that a man in his 60s had been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. They also confirmed that searches were being carried out at multiple addresses connected to the investigation. That confirmation alone was enough to trigger a wave of questions, because this wasn't just any investigation. This involved someone who, for decades, had held one of the most visible roles in British public life, and almost immediately, attention turned to Buckingham Palace. What would the king say? Would he remain silent, as monarchs often do during active legal matters, or would he address the situation directly? The answer came faster than many expected. In an official statement, King Charles acknowledged the news with what he described as deepest concern. He emphasized that what follows must be a full, fair, and proper process, handled by the appropriate authorities. But then came the line that many observers focused on most: the law must take its course. It was a simple sentence, but in the context of royal tradition, it carried enormous weight, because historically, royal responses to sensitive matters have often been cautious, measured, and limited. Yet this statement struck a very specific tone, one centered not on family, but on process. Why would that distinction matter so much? Because it signaled something subtle, but important. A shift from private concern to public accountability. And that shift didn't happen overnight. To understand it, you have to look at Andrew's role in public life and how it evolved over time. For many years, Andrew served as the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment. In that role, he traveled extensively representing British business interests abroad. It was a position built on trust. Trade envoys often handle sensitive discussions, build diplomatic relationships, and promote economic partnerships. With that responsibility came strict expectations, especially regarding confidentiality and public conduct. So when reports emerged that authorities were examining allegations related to the handling of confidential information, it immediately raised serious questions. Questions not only about the details of the investigation, but about how the royal institution itself would respond. And that's where the timeline becomes even more revealing. Because before this arrest ever happened, there were already signals that official channels were reviewing newly released correspondence connected to Andrew's past role. According to publicly available information, investigators were assessing whether there were grounds to examine the matter more closely, but even then, the palace response remained consistent, measured, careful, procedural, and always emphasizing cooperation with authorities. Why maintain that approach so consistently? Because the monarchy operates within a constitutional framework, one where legal independence is essential. And that brings us back to the morning of the arrest itself. Because in addition to confirming the arrest, authorities also confirmed searches at multiple locations. That detail suggested something important. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was part of an active investigative process. And in situations like this, every public word carries meaning, which makes the king's closing message even more significant. He didn't speculate. He didn't offer conclusions. Instead, he made it clear that his family would continue their duties and service while the process unfolds. At first glance, that may sound routine, but in reality, it reflects a careful balancing act between personal relationships and public responsibility. And it raises a deeper question. What happens when private family matters intersect with public institutions watched by millions? Because the royal family isn't just a family, it's also a symbol, one tied to national identity, continuity, and public trust. And moments like this test that balance in real time. But there's another detail many people missed, one that makes this situation even more historically unusual. Reports suggest that Andrew may be the first senior royal in modern British history to face an arrest under these kinds of circumstances. If accurate, that alone would make this moment unprecedented. But what makes it even more complex is the broader context surrounding Andrew's public role in recent years. Because long before this investigation, his public duties had already changed significantly. He stepped back from official royal responsibilities, and his public appearances became increasingly limited. At the time, that shift was seen as a turning point. But now, in light of recent developments, it's being viewed through a different lens. Was that moment an early sign of deeper challenges ahead, or simply a precaution during a period of public scrutiny? At this stage, those questions remain part of an ongoing process, and that process is still unfolding. Which brings us back to the King's statement, because in many ways it wasn't just a response, it was a signal. A signal about how the monarchy intends to navigate uncertainty in a modern era defined by transparency, accountability, and public visibility. But there's one more layer to this story, one that goes beyond legal procedure and official statements. It's about perception. Because in today's world, public trust isn't shaped only by outcomes. It's shaped by how institutions respond in moments of pressure. And every word, every action, and every decision becomes part of that story. So the real question isn't just what happens next legally. It's how this moment will be remembered historically, as a crisis, as a turning point, or as an example of an institution adapting to a changing world. Because behind the headlines and official statements, there's a deeper reality unfolding, one that could quietly redefine how the modern monarchy responds to scrutiny forever. And the next phase may reveal even more about that transformation. But to fully understand why this moment carries so much weight, you have to look at what happened behind the scenes in the days leading up to the arrest. Because this wasn't a sudden event without warning. According to publicly available reports, authorities had already begun reviewing a formal complaint earlier in February. That complaint reportedly focused on whether confidential information may have been handled improperly during Andrew's time as a UK trade envoy. At first, the review was described cautiously. Officials emphasized that they were assessing whether there were sufficient grounds to move forward. No conclusions were announced, no assumptions were confirmed, but even that early stage was enough to trigger intense attention. Why? Because of the timeline. Andrew's role as Special Representative for International Trade and Investment lasted from 2001 to 2011. During that period, he served as a bridge between British businesses and international partners, meeting government officials, attending economic forums, and promoting investment opportunities. It was a role designed to strengthen global relationships, but it also came with strict expectations. Trade envoys are bound by confidentiality, not only during their service, but even after their official duties end. So when questions emerged about historical communications connected to that period, investigators reportedly began examining whether any official protocols may have been affected. And that brings us to another key moment, because on January 30th, a new set of documents was publicly released as part of broader proceedings connected to Jeffrey Epstein. These releases included correspondence that had not previously been widely available, and almost immediately, advocacy groups and legal observers began reviewing the material closely. One organization, Republic, reportedly submitted a formal complaint, arguing that certain communications raised questions worth examining further. It's important to emphasize that at this stage, these were allegations, not conclusions. And Andrew has consistently denied any wrongdoing. But the existence of a formal complaint changed the situation, because once a complaint is filed, authorities have a legal obligation to assess it objectively, and that's exactly what they did. According to official statements, Thames Valley Police confirmed they were reviewing whether the information met the threshold for a formal investigation. At the time, the language remained careful and procedural. There were no dramatic announcements, just confirmation that the process was underway. But here's where things become even more revealing. Because while investigators were conducting their assessment, Buckingham Palace also issued a statement. And that statement contained a message that, in hindsight, now appears especially significant. It made clear that the palace would cooperate fully with law enforcement if approached. Not resist, not deflect, cooperate. That choice of wording mattered, because it reinforced a principle that has become increasingly central to the modern monarchy: the importance of operating within the same legal framework as every other public institution. But even then, few expected the situation to escalate as quickly as it did, which brings us back to February 19th. The arrest itself was confirmed by authorities in neutral, factual language. They did not initially name the individual publicly. Instead, they described him simply as a man in his 60s from Norfolk. This approach follows standard procedure. Investigations prioritize due process. They focus on facts, evidence, and legal thresholds, not public perception. But once the identity became widely understood through media reporting, global attention intensified almost immediately. Because this wasn't just a legal story, it was a constitutional moment. And once again, attention turned to the king. Would he remain silent this time, or would he address the situation directly? His answer came in the form of that carefully written statement, signed simply, Charles R. That signature alone carried symbolic meaning. It wasn't a personal note, it was a constitutional response. Because when a monarch signs with that designation, they are speaking in their official capacity, not just as a brother, but as the sovereign. And his message remained consistent with everything the palace had emphasized before. Support for lawful process, respect for investigative independence, commitment to public duty. But there was also something else in that statement: restraint. He made it clear that it would not be appropriate to comment further while the process continues. That restraint reflects one of the most important principles in constitutional monarchies: the separation between the crown and the legal system. The monarch does not interfere. The law proceeds independently, and that independence protects the credibility of both institutions. But while the king's words focused on process, another question quietly emerged, one that had less to do with law and more to do with the future of the monarchy itself. Because moments like this don't just affect individuals, they shape public perception for years to come. And that perception had already been evolving long before this arrest. Andrew had stepped back from official royal duties in 2019, following controversy surrounding his associations and public scrutiny. At the time, that decision was described as a way to prevent distraction from the work of the royal family. It marked a significant shift, because royal roles are not just ceremonial, they represent continuity, stability, and public trust. By stepping back, Andrew effectively removed himself from the institution's public-facing responsibilities. And in the years that followed, his visibility decreased significantly. He no longer represented the monarchy at official events. He no longer carried out public engagements on behalf of the crown. He became, in many ways, a private citizen with a historic title, but without an active public role. That distinction matters now more than ever, because it changes how institutions respond. This is no longer about an active working royal carrying out official duties. It's about an individual subject to the same legal processes as any other citizen. And that's exactly what the king's statement emphasized, without saying it directly, because sometimes what isn't said is just as important as what is. The absence of defense, the absence of speculation, the absence of interference. All of it reinforces one message: that the monarchy intends to respect the independence of the legal process. But there's still one critical question left unanswered. What happens next? Because an arrest is not a conclusion. It's the beginning of a legal procedure designed to establish facts objectively. Investigators will review evidence. Authorities will assess findings. Legal standards will determine the outcome. And throughout that process, public attention will remain intense, not because of sensationalism, but because of historical significance. Moments like this rarely happen, and when they do, they become part of a larger story about institutions, accountability, and public trust. But perhaps the most important development isn't the arrest itself. It's how the monarchy is choosing to respond, and what that response reveals about its future. Because in many ways, this moment is about more than one individual. It's about how a centuries-old institution responds to modern expectations. The British monarchy has always existed in a unique position, both symbolic and constitutional. It represents continuity, tradition, and national identity. But it also exists within a legal system built on independence and equality under the law. And when those two realities intersect, every decision matters. The king's response didn't attempt to influence the outcome. It didn't attempt to shape public opinion. Instead, it reinforced something more fundamental, that legal processes must unfold independently, regardless of personal relationships or historical roles. That message reflects a broader shift that has been quietly unfolding over the past several years. Because the modern monarchy operates in a world very different from the one that existed even a generation ago. Information moves faster. Public scrutiny is constant, and transparency is no longer optional. It's expected. This means institutions must adapt, not by abandoning tradition, but by reinforcing the principles that allow them to remain credible in a changing world. And that's exactly what makes this moment so significant. Not because of dramatic statements, but because of measured restraint. Because sometimes the strongest message is the one that avoids speculation entirely. But here's the deeper question many observers are now asking. Is this moment simply an isolated legal process, or is it part of a broader transformation in how the monarchy defines its role in the 21st century? To understand that question, you have to look at the pattern of recent years. King Charles has emphasized efficiency, accountability, and a more focused royal structure. He has reduced the number of working royals. He has clarified roles. He has prioritized public service and institutional stability. These changes weren't sudden. They were gradual, deliberate, strategic. And moments like this test those changes in real time. Because leadership isn't defined during calm periods. It's defined during uncertainty. The king's statement, brief as it was, reflected that reality. He acknowledged concern. He affirmed cooperation. He emphasized legal independence. And then he stepped back, allowing the process to move forward without interference. That decision reflects confidence in the system itself. Confidence that institutions can function independently. Confidence that accountability and tradition can coexist. And confidence that public trust is strengthened not through control, but through transparency and restraint. But beyond legal outcomes and official statements, there's another dimension to consider: public memory. Because moments like this become part of history, they shape how institutions are understood, not just in the present, but for decades to come. Future historians won't just examine the investigation. They'll examine the response, the tone, the restraint, the decisions made under pressure. And those decisions may ultimately define the legacy of this period more than any single headline ever could. Because while investigations focus on facts, history focuses on meaning, and the meaning of this moment is still being written. As this situation continues to unfold, the biggest story may not be the legal process itself, but how the monarchy continues to evolve in response to modern expectations.